Right. Hello, everybody. Our shir today is entitled Between Law and Magic. The Mezuzah as a test case in shifting cosmologies. And what we're going to do is, based on the research by Professor Oded Yisraeli, we're going to look at how the Mezuzah was understood through various periods of Jewish history. And what becomes very interesting through this process is we see that the reasons given during all these different times vary very distinctly one from the other, so that it becomes impossible to say what really is the reason for the Mezuzah. And yet, we're going to conclude with some extracts taken from contemporary Jewish literature, from Chabad in particular, to show that the Mezuzah is presented absolutely in one side from one particular perspective that sharply digresses from the multiplicity of views that we're going to explore now. So let us begin. We begin with the Talmudic period, the Gemara period, from the year 200 more or less to the year 500 CE. And in the Gemara, we generally find that the Mezuzah is presented in a rather legalistic framework. You got the halachas, the laws applying to the Mezuzah, and Shmonya is just showing us pictures on his holiday to Mauritius. It looks very nice. Nice view from your window, Shmonya. Welcome to Morgan and to Nati. But generally speaking, in the Talmud, the halachic framework is presented. However, a lot of these sources speak in many voices, which is very important for our discussion. We also find interwoven between these legal explanations and intricacies that the Talmud touches upon. We also find the protective notion of the Mezuzah comes to the fore. So, for example, we have the famous story in Gemara in Avodah Zarah with Unklus, and Unklus makes the analogy, says that with a king of flesh and blood, the king sits inside his palace, inside his house, as it were, and protected by the guards outside, whereas when it comes to Jewish people observing the Mezuzah, the Jewish people sit inside, and God, as it were, protects from the outside. So that's a Talmudic view. The reason why I'm mentioning it is to show that besides the legal explanations, we also have here the idea that existed as early as Talmudic times, that the Mezuzah does afford a degree of protection. There's another case as well in the Gemara, in Menachot. Rebbe Hanina says that the Mezuzah protects the inhabitants of the home. So once again, another reference to protection. And then Shmuel comes along, and Shmuel says that in fact, it doesn't just protect, but there is a mechanism involved. There's almost I don't want to use the word mystical yet, because we use the word mystical more when we come to the Zohar, but there's an added dimension besides the halacha in the Mezuzah, and that is that if you misplace it, it doesn't work. In other words, if you put it wrong, if it's skewed, if it's facing one way, if it's facing another way, if the letters aren't correct, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. That's what Shmuel says. And he also says, sakana v'ein bar mitzvah. In other words, there could be a sakana, a danger, implying a spiritual danger may befall you if you do not have a correctly placed or kosher mezuzah. So there we have some examples from the Talmud. I've left out the legal examples because we all know some of the halachas of the mezuzah, but we do find that while there is a predominant, this point I'm trying to make, there was a predominant legalistic view in the Gemara, with a few pepperings of the notion of the protective qualities of the of the Mezuzah. Okay, so now we've done our introduction, which is the Talmud. Always a good place to go because it's a fundamental Jewish source. Good place to start, I mean. Now, let's go to number 2. Our second source, or our second body of literature that we're going to look at, is the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. Now, the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael was written, no one is quite sure when it was written, but the views range from somewhere between the 3rd century and the 8th century. So somewhere between the early Talmudic period and the post-Talmudic period, somewhere between those two poles, comes the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael. In the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, we're just going to refer to it from now on as the Mechilta. So in the Mechilta, we found the earliest reference to not just protection. We saw protection already peppered into the Talmudic sources, but we found our earliest reference to a theurgical, which means a magical. Theurgy is where you do something that affects the cosmos, and the cosmos shines down positively towards you as a result of your actions. So we're going to call it a theurgical, mystical approach. But you find the first time in Jewish literature a theurgy in the Mezuzah, this magical notion that if you have the Mezuzah will respond by benefiting you in some way. So our first example of this way of thinking, this theurgic, mystical approach, is in the Mechilta. Now, how does the Mechilta frame it? Very cleverly, because the Mechilta doesn't come up with an innovation that theurgy is an innovation. It bases itself on the Torah, on the Bible. In Shmot, when the Jewish people leave Egypt and the plague of the firstborn, we had to sprinkle blood on the doorposts, on the mezuzot of the houses, and then the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, would know which was the Jewish home and would spare the inhabitants, and they wouldn't have to suffer the plague of the firstborn. From this we see, says the Mechilta, that the divine presence, now just note the expression divine presence, because we're going to talk about a lot of things that protect us by the Mezuzah. The conceptualization that different entities protect us. Sometimes the angels, in this case it's God, the divine presence. Sometimes it's the Sfirot when we come to the Zohar. So who's doing the protecting? It becomes quite an interesting question. So bear in mind that the Mechilta says, and it's an early source, so it's sticking more or less to the straight and narrow, more or less a biblical perception and interpretation of the biblical perception. The blood now becomes symbolic of the Mezuzah, or the Mezuzah is symbolic of the blood. But who does the protecting in this case, as perceived by the Mechilta? The divine presence, the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah stands and the Shekhinah protects. Very similar to the Talmud, because when they produced at the same time, we would say in Unclus's analogy that the king stands outside. God, the king, protects us from outside, but it's God. It's not angels. It's not Sfirot. Sfirot didn't exist the way we understood them now. Sfirot only came about from the 13th century when the Zohar was first publicized. So our two sources now speak about the primary protector being God. So our second source, the Mechilta, says that the Shekhinah protects us just like the blood protects us in biblical times. But then it introduces a notion which you don't find in the Talmud. In the Talmud, it's also God. Here it's God, but it's God plus. Here it's God plus because the Mechilta says there are 10 unique names of God. So we see now that we're introducing like the beginnings of Jewish mysticism, or a beginning of a system of Jewish mysticism, which is no longer just this unexplainable being that we call God. God is quite a definable being and a divisible being in a sense. I mean, not contradicting his oneness the way the Kabbalists explain it, but we don't have Kabbalists yet. We only use the word Kabbalists from the time of the Zohar. But the mystics, you can see now, are beginning to interpret God as having 10 unique names. God's name is comprised of 10 unique names, and these unique names operate at different times of the day. So 24/7, you're covered by the protection of the 10 names, and the 10 names almost act in shifts in protecting. So it's still God doing we haven't come on to angels yet or spheroids, as I said. It's still God, but we have a theurgy in the God. It's not just God with indivisible being, but it's God becoming a mechanical being where we can articulate aspects within that God entity that conducts a protective service for those who have a mezuzah on their door. And it's important to point out that this is a theurgic approach. It's a magical, mystical approach. Because for our purposes, we're going to go a little bit into Jewish mysticism as well. But you've got two approaches with things that protect you. You can have a didactic approach. Didactic means to teach. In other words, you learn a lesson. This is the approach that later Rambam was to adopt, which we'll come into in a moment. In other words, the mezuzah is a significant entity of literature that tells us that God protects us, but it has no magic. That's called a didactic approach. No, and then you have the Mechilta now developing what we call a theurgic approach, this magical, mystical approach, which is an apotropaic approach, meaning not just mystical and magical, but it has a power to ward off. That's what the term means. Apotropaic. It wards off evil spirits. It chases away demons. It's almost like a demon hunter. It gets rid of evil forces. So it's accepting the notion of the existence of evil forces that can be destructive. But at the same time, if you have the power or the knowledge or the mechanism here through the 10 names of God, so it's still God. We're not onto angels yet, still God, but it is in the sense of warding off the mashchis, the malach hamavet that is coming to destroy us, relating it again to the biblical story of the Exodus and the blood on the doorposts. And the Mechilta develops the notion, which we still have today, that Pesach, Passover, is the nights of Passover are known as Leil Shimurim, the night of guarding or the night of protection. Shmira means protection. Leil Shimurim, the night of protection, the nights of protection, where the divine presence, but divided into 10 names that mechanically operate at different hours, protects us during this Leil Shimurim. We can detect, especially if we take the date of the Mechilta to be a little bit later, it's closer to the 8th century, not the 3rd century, where the Heichalot literature is already quite well embedded within the Jewish tradition. Because with the Heichalot literature, it did exist in the early times of the Talmud as well, but it reached its head just in the period prior to the Zohar. 8th century would be around about that particular time. And the Heichalot literature, we're going to introduce another notion now. The Heichalot literature, Heichalot means chambers. Usually we refer to Heichalot and Merkava, the chariot and the chambers mysticism. The Heichalot mysticism believed that the heavens are comprised of Heichalot, which means halls or chambers. And these halls and chambers are filled with angels. There's a hierarchy of angels. So there's archangels and there's higher angels, lower angels, and angels in charge of this and angels in charge of that. And there's an army, there's a host of the heavens, angelic hosts of the heavens. And the Heichalot literature wax lyrical when it comes to the notion of angels. So we can call the mysticism of the Heichalot a mysticism of angelology, not yet Sefirot, because we're not yet at the Zohar, but it is a mysticism of angels. Now, what's significant about our Mechilta that we mentioned right now? We said that the divine presence stands outside and protects us through the Mezuzah. So we can already see, it's probably an indication that this is an older source where we already had the notion of angelology, but the Mechilta was trying to make a break from that earlier form of mysticism to a newer, perhaps you might want to say more sophisticated, I don't like to use that word, but a different kind of evolved theology or mysticism, or cosmology rather, where it's not the angels that are doing the protection, it is God himself doing the protection. So you can possibly detect in that Mechilta, where the divine presence through the 10 names protects, you can detect a possible break by emphasizing the divine presence as opposed to the angels, a possible break from the Heichalot literature into a new kind of mysticism, because mysticism is always evolving, continuing even to this day, as we shall explore in a moment. So what happened later on, if I can jump ahead to the time of the Zohar, just to highlight the difference, emphasize the difference between the angelology of the Hechalot and the Sfirot of the Zohar. What the Zohar does is it takes, for example, the angel of mercy, the Malach of Rachamim, and turns it into a Sfira of Rachamim. And you get Chesed and Sfirot on the right-hand side, which are the more compassionate ones, as opposed to the Sfirot of Gvura, the negative ones, or the feminine ones on the other side, on the left-hand side. Okay, so that's the Mechilta. That's the Mechilta text, and we can, I think, by looking at this text, and by virtue of the fact that it highlights the divine presence does the protecting, in a world where we already know people believe that angels were doing the protection, this indicates that we're on some kind of mystical trajectory. That's the point that we're trying to make over here. So we've done the Talmud, predominantly legalistic, but protective elements, no mystical, no magic yet, but protection. That's the Talmud. Now we've done the Mechilta, 3rd, 8th centuries, probably towards the 8th century, and we now have God, or God's presence, but it's the 10 names of God that are operating throughout the entire day in shifts, and these unique names, the different names do different jobs of protection during those 24-hour period. So we've moved into a kind of a theory, a kind of a magic. Possibly a break from Hechalot, where it's the angels, now it's God. So that's the progression. We can see already some kind of a projection. Let's go on to our third group. We go a little bit later into Jewish history now, to the period just before the Zohar, but it also interlapped into the period of the Zohar. And this is the period of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, known as the German Pietists. Started predominantly in Germany. According to the research, a huge percentage of the philosophy of Hasidei Ashkenaz was taken from perhaps German folk beliefs, non-Jewish German folk beliefs, Hasidei Ashkenaz, the Pietists of Germany. But they were very much a mystical movement. Hasidei Ashkenaz. They flourished between the 12th and 13th centuries. Remember, Zohar only first published 1290, towards the end of the 13th century. So Hasidei Ashkenaz preceded the Zohar by 200 odd years. Obviously, there's not real nice, clear beginning and end, but the Hasidei Ashkenaz certainly preceded the Zohar. So we're going to look now at Hasidei Ashkenaz and their view on the Mezuzah. We find something very interesting over here. Obviously, they adopt the notion of protection, and obviously, they adopt the notion of angels. They went back to the angels. There were moves away from Hechalot, but Hasidei Ashkenaz went back to the angels. They went back to angelology. So while there's a trajectory, there's a bit of to and fro taking place as well. So very interesting to map this progression. Sometimes it's a regression in a sense. But not only did they go back to Hechalot, Everyone else was moving away from Hechalot, as we saw with the Mechilta, but the Chassid Ashkenaz went back to the angels. They didn't like the break that the Mechilta had made with angelology, so they went back to the angels. But they didn't just go back to the angels, they go back to the notion, or they don't go back, they actually innovate. That now in the Mezuzah, you must write the names of the angels in the Mezuzah. In the actual parchment of the Mezuzah, you must write the names of the angels that offer protection. So in the klaf, in the actual parchment of the Mezuzah, we've got the Shema and V'hayam Shemua. In the white spaces around the margins, you must write names of angels, and these names of angels will ward off, once again, the apotropaic notion, to ward off negative forces. The angels will now ward. So it's no longer the Mechilta, where the divine presence wards off the negative forces. We've gone back to the angels who ward off the negative forces. We've gone back in history, gone back in mystical history in a sense. It's now the angels, we've gone back to Hechalot. And the angels, not just the angels, but we write their names. So their names, remember with the Mechilta, we had the divine names of God, but they were never written down. They worked the theurgy, the magic as it were. Now, going back to the angels, it's the angels doing it, but we write the names of the angels in the parchment. And this was a big halachic problem for many of the rabbis at that time, because the question arose, well, it's fine and good chasing away all the negative spirits with the names of angels, but is your mezuzah still kosher? That was a problem, and we're going to see how various rabbis dealt with that. But that is what the Hasidic Ashkenaz did. They went back to the old notion of the Hechalot. They reintroduced the angelology after we thought that Mechilta had moved away with the focus on the divine presence. But not only did they go into the angelology, they went back to saying you must write the names of the angels on the parchment. Okay. Our fourth period of Jewish history, also around about Hasidic Ashkenaz, and at the beginning now of the Zohar, going a little bit into the Zohar. And remember, Hasidic Ashkenaz went, quite a lot into the period of the Zohar. But we're now going to a fascinating character, Rabbi Yosef Gikatila, 1248 to 1304. Zohar is published 1290. So he's right in the middle of the period when the Zohar comes out. Now, Gikatila is an interesting individual, because he was very close to the circle of the Kabbalists that produced the Zohar, or if you want to say that publicized the ancient Zohar, whichever view you want to take. We're not going into that. But he was part of the circle that certainly brought the Zohar out into the open, whether for the first time or for the second time, whichever view you want to take. But there is a view that he may also have been one of the authors of the Zohar, which puts him on par with people like Rabbi Moshe de Leon. Some people say he was the sole author, but many people say that the Zohar has multiple authors, possibly for over multiple periods of time as well, as we saw with the research by Meroz some weeks ago. But nonetheless, Gikatila is an important player, a possible author of the Zohar, but certainly an influencer when it came to the Zohar. And he writes a book. Now, for our purposes, this book is very significant, because what's this book called? It's called Sod HaMezuzah. So this is a wonderful resource to look into right now. Let's see now how Gikatila viewed the Mezuzah. Remember, he's right slap bang in this period, just before we move on to the notion of the Sfirot, which came out for the first time in the Zohar. Yes, I know that Bahir speaks about it, the earlier Bahir, but they'd never understood the Sfirot the way as the Zohar, which means the way we understand the Sfirot. So the term might have existed, but the way they understood the term was completely different. So he's just before we're about to move into the change where it's not the angels, but it's the Sfirot that do the spiritual work. Gikatila emerges a possible author of the Zohar. And he does introduce the notion of Sfirot. See, each one of these people in groups introduce something new. The theurgy was brought in by the Mechilta, as we saw. Now the Sfirot are being brought into the Mezuzah for the first time by Gigatila. But he doesn't develop the Sfirot to its full extent because he's right at the beginning of the period of the Zohar. But he does relate the protection of the Mezuzah now to the Sfirot for his first time. So it's no longer God, or let's do it in chronology. It's no longer the angel, then it's no longer God, now it's the Sfirot. But what he does, because he's in the period bridging Heichalot to the Zohar, he includes the angels as well. So he speaks about dual protection. You can see how this development is taking place. He's introducing the Sfirot that do the protection, but he also can't break away from the angelology. So there's a partnership between the Sfirot and angels. So this wasn't a perfectly pure Zoharic concept where you have pure Sfirot in action. It's a mixture somehow of Hechalot mysticism and Zoharic mysticism. We have the Sfirot plus the angels. The period right at the transition between Hechalot and Zohar. So here we have the Sfirot, and they have camps of protecting angels. Camps. In other words, hierarchies of angels doing the protection. So the way Gigatila describes the protection of the Mezuzah is as follows. He says, and I'll quote you from Gigatila, he says, the Mezuzah guards us and gives us protection. All right, good. So this we already know. Many people have said this already. The Mezuzah offers us protection so that the evil forces may not enter the house. So we have the notion again of warding off evil sources. They do not enter the house. Gigatila goes on to say, when a man leaves the house, he doesn't only have protection while he's inside the house, he or she or they or whoever they are, when the people leave the house, they get protected. They fall under that same umbrella of protection, even though they're no longer within the confines of the Mezuzah. But then who's protecting them? The camps of the angels. They follow the man who has the Mezuzah on the door. They follow the man and protect the man outside in the street. And where do these angels come from, says Gigatila? They come from 2 paragraphs in the Shema that's written in the Mezuzot. The first paragraph is the paragraph of Shema. The second paragraph is Vayam Shema, as we know from the Shema, the first 3 paragraphs. The first 2 of the 3 paragraphs, they actually allude to the angels, or they activate the angels. So the text of those 2 paragraphs are the angels that protect the person when they leave the house, and they come from those 2 paragraphs. And thereby the person is protected when they leave the homes. So this is what Israeli writes. He says it's a bit of a disappointment because we've moved away from the angels. We've moved, to the divine presence. We're coming right into the Zohar. Here we have a possible author of the Zohar, but he's still holding on to the notion of angelology, which fits into our theme that we're going to touch upon, or that we're going to elaborate, that the Zohar speaks in many different voices. So here we would have a voice in the Zohar that is very much connected to the notion of angels and angelology. So that's Gigatila. Right. A step towards the Sfirot, yes, but a step back to the angelology of the Hechalot literature. All right, let's move on to the next text is going to be the Zohar. Now comes the Zohar proper. Gigatila was at the beginning of those, perhaps one of the authors, but now we come to the Zohar itself. When was the Zohar written? We know that this is a hotly debated issue. It's written in Aramaic, and it's written in the style of the Talmud, and it's written with names of the Tanaim. But yeah, obviously, some people are going to say, well, that's proof that it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the 2nd century. Other people say, no, it was written to look as if it was written in the 2nd century, thereby framing it intentionally, 1,000 years earlier, 1290 to the 2nd century is 1,000 odd years, to make it look as if it was produced in that time. But when you start looking at the writing of the Aramaic, it was a very different Aramaic. The use of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is Babylonian. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would have been from the Eretz Yisrael, would have been Shimon ben Yochai. Aramaic was different. There's Spanish words that are used, etc., etc. One of the interesting clues that the Zohar may be of some later origin, this is rather interesting, is that it reflects, and I found this fascinating, it reflects a genre in the literature that was dominant in the period just preceding the emergence of the Zohar. And what is that genre in the literature that all the rabbis were writing about? If you can use the term all the rabbis, but many rabbis were writing in a certain genre. They were interested in a certain idea. The Zohar speaks about that same idea, which means that they are possibly linked in terms of time. What's that genre? Ta'amei hamitzvot. There was an obsession or an interest, a profound interest in reasons for the commandments, supplying reasons for the commandments. And up until then, we had mitzvahs, everyone did mitzvahs, everyone just accepted that we do mitzvahs. There was no need to try to explain why we do mitzvahs, why I put on tefillin, why I have a mezuzah, why I can't mix milk and meat. We just know that we can't do it, and we've got halachas. No one, even in the Gemara, you don't find, you find them expounding on the details of the halacha, not expounding on the philosophy behind the mitzvot. But here there was now, 11th, 12th, 13th century, a tremendous interest in explaining the reasons behind the mitzvot, ta'amei ha-mitzvot. And you find this in circles that were very close to the Zoharic circles of Spain. So you find this interest in ta'amei ha-mitzvot in the school of Ramban Nachmanides. He's interested, and his school and his students are interested in ta'amei ha-mitzvot. No coincidence that the Zohar also is preoccupied a short while later, because Nachmanides died about 20 years before the Zohar came out. I think in 1270, Zohar came in 1290. But his interest in ta'amei ha-mitzvot was reflected very soon after his death in the Zohar. There were also manuscripts, a lot of manuscripts that came out in the period just before the Zohar emerges that dealt profoundly with the notion of ta'amei ha-mitzvot. I'm going to mention their names just so you can get an idea how strong this notion was. We have Sefer HaRimon. That is one book that we know was written by Moshe de Leon. That book is obsessed with reasons for the mitzvot. No coincidence that he was the author or one of the authors that Zohar reflects ta'amei ha-mitzvot, giving reasons for the commandments, obviously mystical reasons for the commandments. We have another work aptly titled Ta'amei ha-mitzvot by Rabbi Yosef Meshulin Habira, and that book expounds, also just before the Zohar, expounds on the reasons behind the Zohar. And another book also called by exactly the same way, Sefer Ta'amei ha-mitzvot. They even call the books the same. This is by the great Kabbalist Rabbi Menachem Rekanati. Also ta'amei ha-mitzvot, an obsession with finding the reasons for mitzvot. And in fact, Moshe Idel writes that the bulk of literature at the time preceding the Zohar, the bulk of Jewish literature, was involved in one way or another with ta'amei ha-mitzvot, finding reasons for the commandments, which is no code. It's therefore no coincidence that the Zohar, coming out for the first time in the open into the 13th century, would have also dealt with the notion of ta'amei ha-mitzvot. So this could be an indication also of the Zohar's later, slightly later, or 1,000 years later, authorship. And the Zohar expounds a lot on Ta'amei HaMitzvot, but obviously giving it a magical, theological dimension as well. So the more rational thinkers within Judaism, like the Rambam, would have given more rational reasons for the mitzvot. The mystics gave more mystical reasons for the mitzvot, but they were all consumed with the notion of explaining through their own particular lenses the reasons behind the mitzvot. The Zohar's emphasis on mysticism, of course, was in stark contrast to Maimonidean thinking. Maimonides dies 86 years before the Zohar comes out, but Maimonides obviously felt the first stirrings of the mystical teachings even during his time, and Maimonides had written explicitly that he was against the idea of writing the names of angels in the Mezuzahs. He dedicates a lot of his time to writing that you're not allowed to write the names of angels in the Mezuzot. So he didn't like the explanation that Ta'amei HaMitzvot, the reasons for the mitzvah of the Mezuzah, that the angels protect you. But yeah, he had a different way of understanding. It was more logical understanding that he reminded of the mitzvot. It's like tzitzit. You look at the you remember the commandments, and in fact, he heaps the two right next to each other. He says the mezuzah is like the tzitzit. They both remind you of the mitzvot that you have to do. It's a very rational interpretation of those two mitzvot, mezuzah and tzitzit, as opposed to talking about angels and divine presence and camps of angels, etc., etc. But that was Maimonides. But it's interesting to see that later on, when the Zohar, but we'll touch upon this in a moment, when the Zohar started giving reasons for the commandments, it also had a rational trend in it. That's what's so fascinating. Obviously, the Zohar is a theological, mystical trend in predominantly Israel, but it also has pepperings of rational thought that it may have taken from Maimonides. In other words, in a strange sense, it's something you're not going to hear often. In a strange sense, Maimonides may have had a profound influence or a significant influence on trends within the Zohar, because there are rationalist trends in the Zohar. And in fact, the section of the Zohar that talks about the protection of the Mezuzah, but the non-theurgic sections of the Zohar, so they're not focused so much on the protection of the Zohar, but they're still on the protection of the Mezuzah, but they're still speaking about the Mezuzah. They also heap it together with tzitzit. So it looks as if that section, that pericope, that section of the Zohar, that rationalist trend or streak in the Zohar, granted it's not predominant, but it is significant, was an almost cut and paste of Maimonides talking about the Mezuzah as a rational interpretation, reminds you, just like the tzitzit reminds you to keep the mitzvot. The Zohar uses almost the same terminology, and it looks like a cut and paste, exactly from the Rambam's Mishnah Torah in this particular instance, which is rather interesting. But even if we look at the, and this is the point that we're making, that the Zohar has different streaks, different trends, mystical and even irrational trend. But even if you look at the mystical, theological trends in the Zohar, fascinating. The Zohar had by now broken completely away from the angelology of the Hechalot literature in terms of the Mezuzah, because it mentions nowhere, not even once, the idea, or there's no encouragement whatsoever that we should write the names of angels into the Mezuzot. And this is significant as well. Why? Because the Zohar was influenced by many people, as we've seen, by many ideologies, mysticism, rationalism, Hechalot, Gigatila, had many different voices that formed part of the Zohar. You can see this in the various pericopes of the Zohar. But interestingly enough, although it was also influenced to a large extent by Hasidei Ashkenaz, who had preceded the Zohar by almost 200 years, as we mentioned, with those mystical German pietists, who introduced writing the angels' names in the Mezuzah. Although Hasid Ashkenaz was an important influencer when it came to the Zohar is quiet when it comes to writing angels' names on the in Mezuzah. It does not recommend, it doesn't mention it. It certainly does not recommend writing angels' names. So it was a break from the angelology which shows this fascinating development, how things are taking a little bit from here, a little bit from there, but they're still moving on. Sometimes they move on and then move backwards. In this instance, it seems that the Zohar went a little bit back in some of its pericopes to the angelology, but in other of its more rational pericopes, it moves more in line with Maimonidean thinking, which negates the whole theurgy in general, never mind angelology. It negates the magic of the Mezuzah, and rather ascribes a function, like a didactic function. We are reminded of the lessons of the Mezuzah, the lessons of the tzitzit, as we have just mentioned. Maimonides was dead against writing the names of mezuzahs, because we know from the Cairo, Geniza Rambam was operated around Cairo, Fostat, Old Cairo, and we find mezuzahs from his time with the names of angels, so we can clearly see that he would have been aware of the custom, which started in Hasid Ashkenaz, and it even went as far from Germany down to Egypt, and we have an archaeological record of this. Rambam was aware of it, and he was strongly opposed to that. What the Rambam writes, and he writes rather sharply, is he says there's a universal custom to put the shin on the outside of the mezuzah. Some people write shakai, shin daled yud, right on the outside of the mezuzah. On the outside of the mezuzah, the mezuzah is folded that way around, so you see the shin, or the shin daled yud on the outside. You don't see the print because the print's folded in the actual scroll. So the shin is on the outside. So the Rambam writes about that there is a custom to write the word Shakai, God's name, with the shin on the outside. And he says that's fine. Why does he say that's fine? Because it's not on the inside, it's on the outside. He knows it's a later development in Jewish tradition. He doesn't seem to be overjoyed that we're writing extra stuff on the mezuzah, but he says that you want to do it, put it on the outside's fine. But he says those who write the names of angels on the inside, he says, and Rambam wasn't afraid to use his words, he says they have no share in the world to come. In other words, they're not Jews anymore. So half the Hasid Ashkenaz and the great influence of the Zohar, according to Rambam, would not have a share in the world to come. They are fools. Rambam's words, not mine. Rambam uses the word fools often, very often. Far too often. He says that they're fools. Not only do they fail to fulfill the commandment, but they actually break. They're actually infringing on prohibitions because they turn the mezuzah into an amulet. I'm quoting from the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. They turn the mezuzah into an amulet. In other words, it's a magic charm for their own personal gain. And once again, according to their foolish mind, look how many times he uses the word foolish. Their foolish minds, they do something to try and secure something for their benefit. They're playing tricks, and they're trying to introduce a theology into Judaism. All right, so Rambam was dead against. But now this is where Rambam becomes fascinating. Because now, listen to this. Not only do we have different voices in the Zohar, which already in itself is, because people say the Zohar says. I don't know if you can ever use the expression the Zohar. What part of the Zohar are you quoting? Which pericope are you quoting from? The same thing when you say the Rambam says. You can't really say the Rambam, which Rambam. Now, usually say, is it the Rambam in Mishnah Torah or the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim? Yeah, we're not even touching on Moreh Nevuchim today. We're talking about Mishnah Torah versus Mishnah Torah, because there's another pericope in Mishnah Torah where the same Rambam contradicts what he just said about the fools who have no share in the world to come, who write the names of angels and they reduce the mezuzah to an amulet. The Rambam in another place, in Mishnah Torah, writes there that a Jew who walks with tefillin on his hands, fringes on his garments, and the mezuzah on his door, has many monitors. He knows he's well protected. How? This is Rambam writing now. See? Rambam contradicting himself. All of a sudden now he's concerned about protection, but we're not finished yet. He says, angels that save him from sinning. Oh, Rambam talking about angels, yes. And here he's not talking about forces of nature like it does in Moreh Nevuchim. We're not even going there. But he's talking about angels. Angels, in our case, through the mezuzah. Angels are now Shakai, Kevin, is we don't say the word Shin Daled Yud Akful, it's like Hashem's name. So Shakai stands for Sha stroke Die. It's God's name. Like Edokim instead of with a Ha, Shakai. But we really mean Sha with a De, Die. Okay, so but Rambam over here now is contradicting himself, and he is talking about angels. Angels protect us from sinning. So the great rational Rambam, who tells you that treating the mezuzah like an amulet and writing angels' names, you don't have a share in the world to come. Suddenly he says, "Now you're protected by many angels." So there are perhaps many voices in the Rambam. Never mind Rambam versus other books, but Rambam in one book in the Mishnah Torah itself. I want to go quickly to look at how Hasidei Ashkenaz influenced the Zohar. We mentioned that they brought angelology back, but the Zohar wasn't prepared to go so far as to adopt the notion of writing the names of angels in the mezuzahs, as we mentioned. But instead, what it does, and again, you can see the trajectory, which is what we're looking at to see how the cosmology changes, which is our concern. How does it change in the Zohar? It does another metamorphosis. It changes the angels into sphirot. So it still adopts the notion of angelology, but with more of a focus or through the lens of the sphirot. As we said before, the angel of Rachamim becomes the sphira of Rachamim. So a lot of the terminology changes, and possibly some of the technology changes as well. And the Zohar then, although there is protection in the mezuzah through a bit of the angels, but now predominantly the angels are becoming more spherotic in nature. But that's only one voice. The other voice in the Zohar, in other pericopes of the Zohar, the Zohar takes a very ambivalent approach to angels and to protection, and to spheres, even spheres do protection. And as I mentioned earlier, it adopts a very Maimonidean approach, which is a didactic approach. You learn a lesson from the mezuzah. The rationalist approach, you learn a lesson from the tzitzit, and again, keeps the two into the same categories as mentioned. But here's one piece of the Zohar. Here, a very interesting section, a very interesting pericope of the Zohar. So Rabbi Abba says, and once again, is it really Rabbi Abba, or is it someone projecting what Rabbi Abba said? We're not going into that. But Rabbi Abba says as follows in the Zohar, that, now remember, we're talking about the Zohar now, so just understand it in the context. When evil entities approach the entrance of a house, I'm quoting from the Zohar, paraphrasing. So now the evil forces are out to get you. You're in your house, but the evil forces want to get you in your house. So they come to your house. What do they see? They see a shin for Shakai. Or they even see the whole name Shakai, but Rabbi Abba is said to say over here, they see the shin facing outwards. That's why the shin faces outwards. So the first thing that the demons or the evil forces see when they come to your house, they see the shin. The shin is there. Now the shin, the Zohar says, signify Shakai, the name Shakai, great, but then add something extra. And for our purposes, this is fascinating. They see the shin, but they don't only see the shin. They see the shin crowned by the letters of the paragraph of Shema and Vayan Shema, which are the two sections that are written of the Torah that are written inside the mezuzah, that's folded up on the inside, that you can't see, but the angels see it. And so the shin, the shin's got little tugging, little like a crown, little lines on the top of the shin. It looks like the shin's wearing a crown. But the Zohar interprets that is those are the angels that you find in Vaya'im Shema and in the Shema. Those are the angels. So what's it telling us? It's telling us that the mezuzah's primary protective power lies not in the text of the mezuzah. How interesting is this? Not in the text. Everyone today emphasizes the text has to be absolutely accurate, otherwise it's not going to work. But according to the Zohar, the text is secondary to the shin. The shin has no halakhic value. It's a later custom. Even Rambam says it's okay. If you want to add it, it's okay. It's not a big deal. But the main mitzvah, of course, are the two paragraphs of the Shema on the inside. But according to the Zohar, the shin is what changes the chases the evil forces away. The texts on the inside just become angels, and they become the crowns to the shin. They're secondary to the shin. It's the crown that the shin wears. But the main work is done by the shin, which isn't even part of the halachic requirement. The outwardly visible shin, that's what chases the demons away. And then Rabbi Yitzchak now, because you remember this is framed like a Talmudic discussion. So Rabbi says this, Rabbi B says that, and then they come to some kind of compromise. The Zohar tries to mimic that same style. So Rabbi Abba has just told us that the demons see the shin, they're protected by the crown of the shin, which is the angels that come from the letters of the first two paragraphs of the Shema. Rabbi Yitzchak then says to Rabbi Abba, hey, hold on a second, wait. If this is the case, that the main thing is the shin, then why on earth do we need to worry about, writing the entire mezuzah on the inside? Everyone was so worried about the mezuzah and the style of the writing and what ksava you got. It's irrelevant. They do a beautiful shin on the outside, and the inside doesn't matter so much. That's what Rabbi Yitzchak is asking Rabbi Abba. If the shin does the job, not the work on the inside, why focus so much on the inside? It's just focus on the shin. Very much like a Talmudic discussion. So Rabbi Abba replies, once again, following the same style of the Talmud. Now I'll explain to you what it means. What I mean is, it is the shin, but the shin is only activated when it works in conjunction with the letters on the inside. And so that's a compromise. It's really the shin, but the inside still matters, so you can't not have the inside. But it's only activated when these two ingredients come together, and the demon sees the shin together with the letters, then the magic takes hold, and that's how. So it's an interesting inversion or use of an argumentative style that you find in the Talmud that is reproduced in the Zohar over here. So it's so interesting because, and this is what Yisraeli points out. He says that through this pericope of the Zohar still maintains the old angelology of Hechalot mysticism, because there's still angels. They've got a bit of secondary degree, the letters hidden on the inside, but there's still angels. But the Zohar never once says write the names of the angels in. So you can see there's this cosmological shift that's taken place with the Zohar. We've seen this with all the different periods of Jewish history that we've highlighted. Each time we move somewhere, sometimes we go back, sometimes we go a little bit forward. This is what the Zohar did with the notion, with the move away from Hechalot into Sfirot, with the move away from angelology to the Zoharic concept of the Sfirot. I did mention that we have pericopes that correspond to the two Maimonides, that are more rational, more didactic, where it seems as if the Zohar is mimicking exactly what the Rambam had said. So that shows us again, we've got different layers, textual layers within the Zohar. Can't really speak about the Zohar. Which pericope are you speaking? Because there were lots of influences, it appears, when it comes to the Zohar. Moshe de Leon, interesting, who is could have been one of the writers of the Zohar. He wrote a book called Sefer Harimon, and it's interesting because Moshe de Leon, and this ties in with the strange notion of a Maimonidean layer of rationalist thought in the Zohar. Because if we look at another book written by Moshe de Leon, Sefer Harimon, and another one of his writings that we know Moshe de Leon definitely wrote, he says over there that the reason for the mezuzah is that you look at the mezuzah and you're reminded of the mitzvot. Just which is exactly what Rambam says, what Maimonides says. It's a didactic lesson. It's not something that works magic. We're not warding off evil spirits. We're educating, we're reminding ourselves of certain rational concepts, rational religious concepts. And Moshe de Leon writes this. So Moshe de Leon himself chose to go the route of Maimonides, which he could have very easily gone a more mystical route from others in his group and in his Spanish circle of Zoharic writers, if they did exist. but he chooses to go the line of Maimonides. Why does he do this? So here's something interesting that you may not know about Moshe de Leon. Moshe de Leon was, in his younger years, a Maimonidean follower, which is fascinating. He regarded Maimonides as his teacher. I never knew this. I found this really, really interesting. And according to Yisraeli, his influence, Maimonides' influence on Moshe de Leon never ever left him. Sometimes we have some of the Kabbalists like Abu Lapia, that sometimes he was also close to Maimonides, and then he kind of moved into this very strange kind of Kabbalah. But it seems with Moshe de Leon, he retained that rationalist trend. So it's quite possible, and it's just my theory, it's quite possible that those pericopes may have been more the result of his hand than some of the other writers of the Zohar, because the Zohar speaks in many, many voices. Now, I'll conclude. Let's jump ahead 800 odd years, and let's come to today. We've seen how the Mezuzah has gone from Talmudic times, mainly legalistic, but also the concept of protection, but no theurgy yet. Then the Mechilta introduces theurgy. Then we looked at some of those other schools that introduced, like Hasid Ashkenaz, introduces the idea of writing the names of the angels based on Heichalot influences, where we have angelology. Then we have the Zohar, which is somewhere between a little bit of angelology, but a bit of rationalism as well. But you can't write the names of the angels on the mezuzahs. But there's still protection in the mezuzah. Rambam's the only one who doesn't really seem to say that there's protection. There's cognizance of what there's that didactic notion. There's cognizance of what the mezuzah is, like tzitzit. But some of these people say tzitzit also protect you like the mezuzah. Rambam didn't dwell on the notion of protection. He was more focused on the didactic notion. All right. Now let's jump ahead. The best source to go to, and I do this with great respect, but I thought the best place to go to for this would be to go to Chabad Online, for the simple reason that a lot of Judaism today is reflective of the mystical notion of Judaism. And I want to show you how contemporary writing today, framed in the name of the Lubavitcher Rebbe and others within the movement, present the notion of the Mezuzah. And once again, remember, it's not a competition. We're not in any way trying to say who's right and who's wrong, because if you try to do that in Judaism, you're not going to last terribly long, because as we've seen, there are conversations and there are so many different voices in everything in Judaism. So yeah, I'm just mentioning that, but it is again fascinating to see, especially after a discussion like we've had today, the cosmic shifts in the Zohar, where we saw the trajectory of a bit of moving away from angelology, moving to some more rational, then sometimes going back a bit, then something jumping ahead, and then a bit of an ambivalent approach where we include both. It seems that with Chabad, particularly Chabad today, we've gone completely into the notion of the protective energies of the mezuzah without the dialectics, without the possibility for there to be anything else. In other words, the mezuzah is only about protection. It's magic. It's theurgic. So after that long line of development in history from Heichalot and Hasid Ashkenaz and Mechilta and Zohar and even Rambam, we've gone back to the notion, maybe not so much angelology, because maybe it's because we're pro-Zohar, so we're very much spherotic. Chabad is very spherotic through the lens of the Arizal, obviously. But it's gone now solely into the idea that the mezuzah is there just to protect it. I'm going to show you this with some quotes from the Chabad site itself. So this is not me. This is something I've taken directly off their site. The Lubavitcher Rebbe explains that unlike other mitzvot, like honoring one's parents, now just listen to this because it's fascinating. Unlike other mitzvot, like honoring one's parents, where you get a reward. What's the reward when you honor your parents? You get long life. I mean, in theory, that's the reward that you get when you honor your parents. Let's just look at it in theory. So for all mitzvahs, you get a reward. But the Lubavitch Rebbe says that there's one mitzvah where you don't get a reward. Protection that's afforded by the mezuzah is not a reward. Listen carefully. It's an immediate and essential result of the observance. I'm going to say that again. When you honor your parents, you get a reward, X, long life. Call it, and I'm not explaining why some people die young. You get a reward, whatever that reward is. Don't worry about the details. You get a reward. So the mitzvah, at some stage, you are rewarded for that mitzvah. When it comes to mezuzah, you don't fulfill the mezuzah, so the rabbi comes, knocks up the mezuzah, and you think, oh, I've done a big mitzvah, I'm going to be rewarded sometime. No, there's no reward. The benefit that you derive is the protection that immediately when you knock up when you knock the mezuzah. So the whole mezuzah is viewed differently. I mean, the cosmology has really shifted. There's no longer a reward for that mitzvah as you get rewards for other mitzvahs. There is no reward, but you benefit from the protection of the mezuzah immediately. Look at that sentence. The protection afforded by the mezuzah is not a reward. It's not a reward. The protection is not a reward for the mitzvah. It is the immediate and essential result of its observance. Okay, so that's a complete reframing. Again, not right or wrong, but it's an interesting reframing of the notion of mitzvot in general, but with an emphasis. It's almost as if you go to any length to show that the essence, not only the essence, but the only aspect of mezuzah is one of protection. And then the Lubavitch Rebbe quotes, as our sages teach us. It's also very interesting. Which sages? We've seen sages don't teach this, even in the Zohar. But he says, as our sages teach us. So, obviously only looking at one stream within the Zohar, but not giving us the option to be aware that there could be another stream. As our sages teach us, the very purpose of the mezuzah is the protection of a house and its inhabitants, full stop. So there you go. It's an open and shut case. It's only about protection. And our sages teach that, full stop. No dialectics, no hither and thither, no room for any other opinions, no room for any other voices that we know existed as we have demonstrated. Our sages, there's one group of people they're called sages, and they all unanimously say that the mezuzah is protection, and that protection is not a reward, it's part of the actual process. Okay, so that's one interesting thing. Let's go to our second point. Again, a quote. The principal book of Kabbalah, which is called the Zohar, says, once again, where does it say? We've seen it says lots of things. That says, if a Jew affixes a mezuzah on his or her door, the Rebbe was very good when it came to women, I might add. The Rebbe was the first person to call women Hasidim, which we've spoken about before. So it's interesting that he adds him or her, which is wonderful. But until now we said when he goes out the house, he. Certainly now him or her, which is lovely. But anyway, when the book of the Zohar, when the principal book of Kabbalah, the Zohar, says that if a Jew puts up a mezuzah on his or her door, the Almighty denies harmful and destroying angels, mazikin, meaning devils, evil forces, entry into the home, even at the time when the destroying angel is let loose, unquote. It's even when the worst angel is let loose, the destroying angel is let loose, the mezuzah will still protect you. Okay? So that's another source. It's only about protection, but it offers the utmost in protection. And once again, this is what the Zohar says. This source completely ignores the didactic pericopes of the Zohar, which have a Maimonidean influence, which equate the mezuzah to the tzitzit, where there's a lesson, a cognitive approach. But here it's framed as if the Zohar says, and this is the only thing that the Zohar says. Here's another example. Now, this is interesting because how does Chabad deal with Rambam? They learn Mishnah Torah, so they would know that the Rambam would have opposed the writing of the names of the angels on the mezuzah. But look now how the Rambam gets framed. It's it's actually a brilliant framing of the Rambam here. It must be clarified Okay, so we're going to clarify that Maimonides did not dispute the protective property of the mezuzah. Oh, that's very interesting. He never said that the mezuzah does not protect you. Nor did he object to the auxiliary use of it for this purpose alone. In other words, the Rambam never objected to protection, and he never objected to someone who wanted to use the mezuzah only for protection. He never objected to that, even though he called the people fools and said that they're turning the mezuzah into an amulet because they're using it for their own purposes. But the Rambam never did that. He strongly objected to practice, but this is how they frame it. So then what did he object to? He strongly objected to practices that halachically invalidate the mezuzah. So you can't write things on the scroll because then your mezuzah is apostle. It's no longer kosher mezuzah. That's what he objected to. But he never, according to this, objected to using it for protection. So the Rambam endorsed, according to this, the whole notion of protection. His opposition was not an ideological opposition. He agreed with everyone else that the mezuzah offers protection, according to this. He only objected to when you start messing with halakha, because then you've turned it into an amulet, which is correct. He did say that. But he objected to that because he still held that the main purpose was protection. Okay, I mean, that's an interesting framing. Here's another quote. In one of the Rebbe's letters, he recommends to his correspondent who complained of nightmares. So someone had nightmares. They wrote, it was a lady, and she wrote to the Rebbe to say, she said, I suffer from nightmares. What does the Rebbe say she should do? So the Rebbe says that she should keep a kosher mezuzah near her bed. In other words, here we have now, again, cosmology changes no longer. Until now, we've always assumed that the mezuzah was on the door. We never discussed taking the mezuzah and carrying it. Now suddenly the mezuzah comes off the door, right? And it works with someone who's suffering from nightmares, but it's not the mezuzah of the door. It's a different kind of a mezuzah because it's not affixed to the door. But it still protects, and it protects even from nightmares. And to someone else, he had also written that mezuzah helps to help someone who suffers from migraines. If you suffer from migraines, you use the mezuzah, but not the mezuzah on the door. This time, you take a kosher mezuzah, it must be kosher, and wrapped in cloth, and keep it with you at all times. There was also a lady. Wrap it with cloth, and she must keep it with her at all times. So the migraines and the nightmares would be helped, and in fact, her health in general would improve, as long as you don't carry it on Shabbos. Okay, that's another step in the developing cosmology of the mezuzah. And finally, the article concludes by saying, countless stories are told and retold in Jewish folklore about people who became well, regained lost jobs, and about barren women who became mothers after fixing or replacing non-kosher mezuzot. Some of these stories have been well documented and published. So, according to this basis, if something has its origins in folklore, and everyone's talking about it, by their own admission in folklore, and you publish it, it becomes documented, and therefore it becomes real. Once it's published and once everyone's talking about folklore, this is an indication that it is real. All right. Now, so our conclusion is as follows. We've traced the trajectory from Talmudic times till our times, and we've shown what I think is a fascinating story of how people viewed the mezuzah, from a stone cold rational approach to very creative approaches where you have angels flying out, chasing demons when the demons see the shin. We've had the angels morph into Sephirot. And then closer to our times, we've had the idea of absolute protection from the Mezuzah to help you, not just with demons, which the ancient classical world was completely consumed with, but now with barren women and with lost jobs and various things like that. The classical sources, and with this I conclude, the classical sources are replete with debates over whether or not there is protection. And is protection by the angels, by the letters, by who? Who does? There's debate, and there's movement. And some say like this, and some say like that. Some say it's not even the writings of the Mezuzahs, it's just the Shilon side, outside. But there's a debate. There are different voices. There are clearly different voices. Rambam even contradicts himself in his Mishnah Torah. So divergent are the voices of the notion of the Mezuzah. That was in classical literature. As we come closer to the literature, the mystical literature of our times, there's no dialogue. There's no different sources do not have a conversation with each other. There's only one view, and that one view is a hyper focus on the protective power, as if this was the only reason for the Mezuzah. In other words, what was once contested has today become normalized and presented as the only explanation for Mezuzah, which is a symbol, not a symbol, a mechanism of protection. It's framed only as protection. It's not even a reward for a mitzvah. Its function is solely to offer theological protection, and not just protection, to offer you whatever it is that you may need. I thank you so much for joining me on this lovely journey, tracing how cosmologies of the Mezuzah have shifted and evolved, progressed and regressed over time. And I look forward to seeing you again next time.